My name is Eric Berger, and this presentation is the result of a survey on the use of mutes I have been conducting for the last few months. The original purpose of this survey was to inform me on the market possibilities for a new mute system that I had been kicking around and developing for about 20 years, and I had offered to share the data I had collected with the respondents of this survey. To be clear about the nature of this survey, I want to point out that the data has no statistical or mathematical significance, except that which you may draw from it. Because of this, there is no margin of error. You are free to use any of the information included in this survey as you wish, and happy to supply anyone with the raw data for their use upon request. Just contact me through my website, ericbergermusic.com. My first question asked each respondent what type of player they considered themselves to be. Because I listed the access to the survey on several Facebook trombone group pages, I expected a higher number of responses from professional or semi-professional players. The data reflects this type of participation, as I had hoped. Next, I asked which types of ensembles each respondent performed or rehearsed with. I gave numerous options, and allowed for fill-in entries. I have to admit I made a glaring omission or mistake in this question. I allowed for only one type of wind band entry, and did not include concert band, symphonic band, wind ensemble, wind orchestra, or military band as separate choices. In an effort to correct this, I combined all these types of responses into one category. Respondents were allowed to choose as many ensembles as they desired. When I asked respondents which type of trombone they frequently play, I was a bit surprised by the large number of players who said they played bass trombone frequently, in greater numbers than played small bore tenor. I guess the axiom bigger is better still rings true. I personally wish I could have responded that I also played contrabass frequently, or even ever. Maybe one. While I attempted to avoid any of my own personal biases from this survey, I realize I may not have been all that successful. From the beginning of my studies in trombone, I had teachers and directors who all emphasized that using mutes is a crucial part of learning the craft, and that mutes were an important part of composers' and arrangers' vocabulary in creating the desired orchestration effects. There were a significant number of comments from respondents who would have answered that they never use mutes, but I did not allow for that option, and so they had to respond with something. Nevertheless, I think the information is helpful. A note about bucket mutes: I did ask respondents to differentiate between bucket mutes that clip or hang on the bell, bucket mutes that slide into the bell, and soft tone or cloth-like mutes. This information is helpful to my original purpose. As with the previous slide, the data on this page might also be skewed because I did not allow for a response of none or no mutes. I guess I assumed that people participating in a trombone mute survey would actually own or use mutes. This number was under 5% of total responses, however. I am surprised that more people commonly carry around Harmon or wah-wah style mutes than bucket mutes. Even though I generally have a Harmon style mute in my full bag, I use it significantly less than I have ever used a bucket. I learned something from this. This slide addresses the behavior of players in relation to the bag of mutes they carry, with over half of the respondents saying they take time to add or subtract mutes from their bag, apparently to avoid carry more mutes than needed. Over a fourth of us carry a full complement of mutes everywhere we go. I would say the data reflects my casual observation, and occasional irritation when someone in the section doesn't have a required mute because they didn't know it would be needed. As I will discuss later, this is the inspiration for my project. By asking if the bulkiness of the mutes was an issue, I had hoped to clarify what I had asked in the previous question, and to understand the motivation of respondents' choices in how and when they carry mutes. It is interesting that the numbers between these two questions do not really line up, but understanding behavior and then the motivating factors behind that behavior is never very neat and tidy. Musicians are taught to consider that quality of tone is always the most important factor in selecting everything about their instrument and accessories, and so it would be inconsistent with this standard pedagogy to claim otherwise. Yet, it is likely this is only part of the equation, while it is seemingly the most important. This second question is a bit more illuminating when considering the second most important factor in mute buying. It shows an even spread over many areas of consideration, which when combined with tone quality likely illustrates actual buying habits. An interesting note, almost 10% of the respondents thought tone was so important, they picked it twice. The purpose of this question was to understand if brand loyalty was important, but it may also be illustrative of buying habits. There is likely a tendency to not just buy one mute at a time, but a couple mutes from the same vendor of the same brand. If you remember back to the last slide, only 20% of respondents said that brand was important when buying mutes. Now on to the fun part, discussing what respondents preferred. In straight mutes, both Dennis Wick and Joe Rall had a 30% share over different materials, Tom Crown had 18%, and Humes and Berg had 10%. All other choices did not score any higher than 2% of respondents. When considering what qualities respondents want from their straight mutes, nearly one-half want a straight mute that is mellow in softer dynamics but gets bright when louder. Over one-third prefer a straight mute that is bright all the time. Nearly one-fifth had other considerations. This question on cup mutes is interesting, because there seems to be a greater variety of preference from respondents than on straight mutes. Two people pointed out in the comments section that I forgot to include an other section, but named the mute they used, and so I included their choice. One other told me that everyone in England was using a certain brand, but he was the only person to mention this fact to me, so I couldn't confirm it. I did add the brand to this list, however. The responses on the qualities players prefer in their cup mute looks very similar to the answers to the same question on straight mutes, but with a bit more respondents preferring a mellow quality overall. On both straight and cup mutes, there was not that much concern about pitch or response, but I think this is more of an indication that these issues have been solved by most brands, and so isn't as much of an issue as it may have been 100 years ago. The responses on bucket mute brand preference surprised me a bit, with 20% of responses stating that they preferred none. I am not sure if this meant they didn't have a preference and use whatever mute they find or are given by their section, or if it means that they don't own a bucket mute and don't care if they did. Either way, more people marked none than the time-tested Humes and Berg clip on bucket mute, and nearly as many marked soft tone, which I personally do not think serves well as a bucket mute in terms of tone or quality, but many prefer because it is lightweight and they can shove it in their sock. I did not have a question on hat mutes, but I would tend to put the soft tone into this category than into a bucket mute category. So much for my own biases. Consistency matters, and so when 20% say none to their favorite bucket mute brand, then I should expect 20% stating they do not care about the quality of their bucket mute. 2/3 preferred either soft or mellow. I have to admit that I am baffled by reportedly high use of Harmon or wah-wah mutes in general. As someone who carried around a full complement of mutes for nearly 40 years, I always had the Harmon or Joe Rall in my bag, getting banged up and bent out of shape, but rarely going in my bell because it was called for on a part. That these mutes are more common than bucket mutes is what really interests me, for a bucket gets called for quite often in big band literature. No surprise that the three top mutes are the Harmon, Dennis Wick, and Joe Rall. I have tried to get people to consider the Humes and Berg, for although it is a heavier mute, it is nearly indestructible and has good intonation and response throughout the range. This slide clearly shows that over half of respondents want a Harmon or wah-wah mute that is easy to play. It is not my intention to carry water for any particular mute, but I will again say that I suggest to anyone who hasn't tried the Humes and Berg to give it a good blow through. I own the Dennis Wick, the Joe Rall, the Harmon, and the Humes and Berg, and I feel the Humes and Berg outplays them all significantly, and only 8% said weight is a factor, which is the only thing about the Humes and Berg that might be a minus. This slide should come as no surprise to anyone, and now I wish I would have asked how many respondents drill a hole in the center of their rubber toilet plunger to improve playability. I had quite a few comments that respondents carry more than one rubber plunger, and I was glad to not be the only one. Comments that stated they carry a soft and a firm mute, or one with a hole and one without. I have 3 plungers, soft, hard, and with a hole, and also a Humes and Berg-Miller plunger. The other question I wished I had asked is, how many use a pixie mute when using the plunger in solo work? Ease of use? Check. Sounds good? Check. Cheap? Check. Any questions? So, yeah, sorry. That was a wah-wah mute, maybe that's why it is so popular. Practice mutes delivered the greatest diversity of responses. Bremner Shush Mute and the Yamaha Silent Brass both took 21% of the votes, and the Dennis Wick taking another 12% and, none, getting 11%. 15 other mute brands were provided to fill in the rest. Another question that caught me by surprise. Only 17% of respondents cared about the volume of the practice mute as a primary reason, and ease of playing and lack of resistance far more important. I think some of the best practice mutes get this right, although I have to state that I really don't use practice mutes much anymore, even though I own a few. Before I present the next slide, I again wish to thank all of those who participated in this survey, and I hope it was illuminating or at least entertaining. The next slide, some of the comments I found possibly relevant, I will allow you to on your own. Thanks for making it to the end.
I'm sorry I almost finished this presentation without actually telling you what it was that I've been thinking about. I've had this idea about creating a set of mutes that the tops and bottoms detach, and the bottoms all nestle into each other because they're shaped the same, and then the tops can all somewhat nestle, reducing the overall volume of maybe a set of 5 or 6 mutes by 75%. The trouble that I realized after doing this survey is that there really may not be that much of a market for a whole new concept in mutes, and there's so many different brands creating mutes now anyways that I don't think it would be marketable to try to make a run at this. I did buy a very large 3D printer to create some prototypes and spent hundreds of hours trying to learn a CAD program, but alas, I'm much too stupid to be able to actually create this file, and so I think I'm going to abandon the whole idea for now.